In the heart of the American Midwest, on the bustling Chicago River, the morning of July 24th, 1915, dawned bright and full of promise. It was the day of the 5th annual company picnic for the employees of the Western Electric Company. For thousands of factory workers and their families, it was a day of rare and eagerly anticipated escape, a festive lake cruise to a park in Michigan City, Indiana. The atmosphere at the Clark Street Bridge was electric with excitement. 5 large passenger steamers were chartered for the event, and families dressed in their Sunday best crowded the docks, clutching picnic baskets and waving to friends. The first ship in line, ready to receive its passengers, was the SS Eastland. To the joyous crowd, it was simply their vessel for a day of fun. They had no way of knowing it was a deeply flawed, notoriously unstable ship, a steel death trap waiting for the right conditions to spring. The SS Eastland had a troubled reputation from the moment it was launched in 1903. It was designed to be fast and sleek, intended for traversing the shallow rivers connecting the Great Lakes. This required a narrow beam and a shallow draft, but it came at a steep cost. The ship was inherently top-heavy and prone to listing alarmingly, even in calm water. Throughout its career, it was known among sailors as a cranky ship. It had experienced several incidents of severe listing that terrified passengers and crew alike. In an attempt to fix its stability problems, previous owners had employed a series of bizarre and ultimately dangerous modifications, including adding tons of concrete to its lower decks as a form of permanent, crude ballast. The most critical and fatal modification, however, was a direct and ironic consequence of another great maritime disaster. In the wake of the sinking of the RMS Titanic in 1912, new international maritime laws, the Seamen's Act, were passed, mandating that all vessels carry enough lifeboats for all passengers and crew. To comply with this new law, the owners of the Eastland were forced to add several massive new lifeboats and heavy concrete life rafts to its uppermost deck. For a ship that was already dangerously top-heavy, this added weight was a death sentence. It raised the ship's centre of gravity to a critical point, making it catastrophically unstable. It was a ship that could, under the right circumstances, simply roll over. On that festive Saturday morning, those circumstances converged with horrifying speed. As over 2,500 passengers began to board, the ship started to list, as it often did. It developed a slight tilt to port, away from the wharf. To counteract this, the crew began pumping water into the ballast tanks on the starboard side. This was a standard, albeit flawed, procedure for the Eastland. However, as more and more people crowded onto the portside decks to wave at friends and escape the heat of the engine rooms, the list to port worsened. The crew, failing to grasp the severity of the situation, continued to pump water into the starboard ballast tanks, a move which, instead of stabilising the ship, only served to make its base less buoyant and its top-heavy nature even more pronounced. The ship was now balanced on a knife's edge. At approximately 7:28 a.m, the list to port became critical. Onlookers on the wharf and on the nearby bridge watched in a mixture of confusion and dawning horror as the ship began to slowly, inexorably roll over. It was a slow, sickening motion that gave people moments to comprehend the unfolding nightmare, but no time to escape it. Water poured through the open gangways and portholes on the port side. On the crowded upper decks, a scene of joyous celebration turned into a cascade of terror. People, picnic baskets and deck chairs began to slide across the tilting deck. A piano in the main ballroom reportedly slid across the floor, crushing several people against a wall. Passengers desperately tried to scramble uphill towards the starboard rail, but the angle quickly became too steep. Hundreds were simply swept off the deck and into the filthy, oil-slicked water of the Chicago River. The true horror, however, was happening inside the ship. The lower decks became a dark, vertical tomb. As the ship rolled, those below deck were plunged into darkness as the generators failed. They were then caught in a horrifying avalanche of heavy wooden furniture, concession stands, and even other people, all crashing down on top of them. Then came the water. It surged through the companionways and cabins, trapping hundreds in the submerged port side of the hull. They were caught in a pitch-black, watery labyrinth with no hope of escape. The entire event, from the start of the final roll to the ship lying on its side in 20 feet of water, took less than 5 minutes. The Eastland had capsized while still tied to the dock, its stern just a few feet from the riverbank. The immediate aftermath was a scene of chaos and mass tragedy in the heart of a major city. Tugboats and rescue workers rushed to the scene, but their initial efforts were focused on the living, pulling hundreds of screaming, struggling people from the river. But soon the grim reality became clear. The hull of the overturned ship was still filled with people, both living and dead. Rescuers with blowtorches and axes climbed onto the exposed, slippery hull and began the gruesome task of cutting holes into the steel plates to reach those trapped inside. For hours they pulled out survivors from air pockets, but mostly they recovered the dead. Divers descended into the murky, debris-filled interior, a horrifying task of navigating a submerged ballroom and tangled corridors to retrieve the bodies of the victims, many of whom were women and children, still in their party dresses. The final death toll was staggering. 844 passengers and crew lost their lives that day. Entire families were wiped out. The Western Electric Company, which had planned a day of celebration, was now faced with burying hundreds of its employees. The city of Chicago was plunged into mourning, its morgues overflowing. The subsequent inquiry placed blame on the ship's engineer for mishandling the ballast tanks, but public outrage focused on the ship's owners and the inspectors who had certified the notoriously unstable vessel as seaworthy just weeks before. In a final, bitter twist, no one was ever successfully prosecuted or held criminally responsible for the disaster. The SS Eastland disaster remains one of the most disturbing shipwrecks in history because of its sheer proximity to safety. It was not a battle against a raging storm or a remote ocean. It was a fundamental failure of physics and human responsibility that unfolded in calm water, in plain sight of thousands, just steps from dry land. It is a chilling story of how greed and negligence converged to turn a happy summer outing into one of the most concentrated losses of life in American history.